So first of all, I'd like to say welcome and thank you to Ian and Paul for the invitation to come and speak. I don't take the privilege lightly, and hopefully today I can share with you some experience. I think my tendency is to say to people over the last 30 years in IT is, why learn all this knowledge if you can't share it? So just would hope that you can get some benefit out of this. And just to get an idea from you guys, where are you at with Catalogue versus CMDB, because you couldn't get two more extreme capabilities, front office and back office. So just hands up, Service Catalogue CMDB. Service Catalogue first? Yeah? Is that what does that mean? Yes, no? Yeah? Catalogue 1 to 10. CMDB? Yeah, cool. And I think over the years, one of the lessons I've learned, even for myself, I've gone through 25 projects in 21 different companies, and I've learned something at every project. And I continue to learn new and interesting ways to do things. One of the chapters in the book is there is no right way. No one person has all the answers. And I think I learnt that very early on in my career, thinking that I had all the answers, until I was politely corrected in a few projects. So today I'm going to present some of my learnings, and I think the reason I wrote the book in the beginning 5 years ago was because I thought I started to see some patterns. And I thought, if I could see these patterns in these projects, were companies really that different? Government, private, 6 people in IT, 1,500 people in IT, and I started to see that actually there wasn't that much difference. Same problems, same issues. Sure, there's scale, but same sort of thing. So over the years I decided I needed to develop a methodology to make things easier. Because going in and doing these projects was a pretty interesting challenge, and certainly the book I wrote was about people. Most of my challenges was, 1, getting to know myself, 2, improving on my people skills. And IT people are pretty hard people to crack, you know? They're not giving away too much, interesting personalities. And I came from that technology background. As a WAN engineer was my last sort of technical role. And, you know, I had lots of fun and games in the industry way back in the 80s. So I'll share with you some concepts today. And please, if there's anything, I'm going to share with you a lot of content today. So I encourage you either to stay behind at the end and grab me and talk about if you want any particular piece of information. I've also got 2 applications that I use to help me do catalogues and CMDB builds. And I developed those applications because I didn't want to wait till it got into a tool to figure out whether it worked. So I kind of built my own mini CMDB builder, and I also built my own little SIAM service definitions application. So you can play with those today as well. And it might give you some ideas and thoughts on how to make life easier. So let's get started. We have a lot of content. I threw a lot in here. I just wanted to give you as much as I possibly could. Some of it you just might go, yeah, look, I've got that sorted. But some of it might give you a couple of ideas. So first of all, the topic. As I said, to me, front office, back office. Catalogue to CMDB, but my biggest challenge was, over the years, was how do I connect the two? Surely there was some connection between the catalogue and the CMDB. And so I guess I wanted to figure out a methodology of data collection. How could I collect information that related these 2 things to each other? So I'll start with some terms of reference, because we all know different definitions. And I encourage people to create their own terms of reference at every site, because it's really about people buying into your definition of these things. And encourage you also to communicate that more broadly, and it's almost, to me, a marketing exercise. So CMDB, for me, contains all the relevant information. Now that's an interesting statement in itself, but I'll talk more about what that means. Products is an interesting term, because in some organisations the term product is well accepted. Other people have no idea what a product definition actually is. And some tools promote product catalogues, some tools don't. So again, I came up with a definition that really made what IT delivers. And of course, another interesting definition is about what is a service. And again, many definitions in documentation on the net, everywhere. And again, I just brought it down to something simple. It's what underpins a business process. Now, catalogues are interesting because people talk about whether it's an integrated catalogue, an enterprise catalogue, what type of catalogue is it. I once remember presenting about Service Catalogue and having an ITIL person come up and say, did you know that there are 8 catalogues in ITIL? And I wasn't sure whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. To me, it just sounded complicated. So I guess I've come up with what I feel is 3 types of catalogues, and I'll talk you through those. So different variations on what is a catalogue. So we'll go into a bit more detail. What is service design? And then what I believe is, for me, encompassing all of those things, is service modelling. And I'll talk a bit about my theory on service modelling and why I believe that service modelling is really the first step before you can do any real transformation. So I go into a little bit more detail about the terms of reference. So with the CMDB, again, deconstructing, you know, you've got lots of documentation and theory, but what are you really trying to say with CMDB? So to me, I created a hierarchical structure that made sense to me. And remember, I'm communicating this to business people. I'm at the senior stakeholder or sponsor level, and these guys, CMDB, like, who cares? So how do I deconstruct that so it's actually meaningful to them, and in simple terms, about building a hierarchy and having a relationship? Integrated service catalogue, and again, trying to construct what is a catalogue, and as it relates to IT, actionable things, services that are delivered, and actually who delivers it. So putting that into a series of governance. Then at an enterprise level, what do people want to see on a catalogue? And it starts from, I just want to see something's broken, I need something, I need to move, to I need to see whether HR or payroll's running, I need to see whether email's operating. And people have very different ideas on what that is. So it's really critical, again, to state your terms of reference. What is that and what does it mean? And it can be difficult because people have different terminology, different ideas, and you sometimes have to rearrange that thinking. Now, the SMP is a document that I wrote and authored probably, 2009? And the reason I wrote it was because a major bank wanted to start onboarding new suppliers. And so I had this moment in time, and you may have had this opportunity to sit down and write a document or something in your organisation where you've had the opportunity to be creative and write something from scratch. And this was a really great moment for me. It was quickly stolen and distributed around a lot of companies. So I see it pop up. Sometimes I go into an organisation, I see the document. I'm like, okay, who wrote that? So these days when we go and meet with customers, we tend to give it away for free. The reason I do that is because I would like to start to see customers defining their services completely for all service characteristics for all of the ITIL processes. So we'll talk a bit more detail about service modelling, but this is I guess a small area where we've focused over the last 5 years, helping companies go in and prepare for tools. So let's talk about some of these critical core capabilities. What's interesting is when you look at the ITIL minimum competencies, you know, 38 processes and 118 sub-processes. So often customers will say, we want to know what our capability is. And, you know, that can be a very interesting, long, drawn-out task, or you can shorten it down. So part of looking at capability maturity is really starting to think about not just the CMMI, but I'll show you some ideas on what I've got around actual measuring the capability. So for me, when I start to look at capability, I start to think about data. I start to think about increasing integration. And often people are asking, well, what does release 1 look like in a capability maturity? And you start to measure your capability in terms of your processes, in terms of what you've implemented. And this really is, to me, defining an organisational capability construct of how you can bring about an improved sense of capabilities. Has anybody here used the CMMI baseline? Yeah? How did you find that? Did you go through a series of questions? You came up with a magic number?
Yeah, well, we had consultants come in and help us through that process.
Right. And without telling any secrets, did you work out 1 to 5 where you were and you were comfortable with that?
Yes.
Yeah? That was
Comfortable.
it was an honest result. Right. Cool. And if you haven't been through that process, you know, there's different ways of measuring it. If you don't have the ability to go out and get an organisation to do that, there's certainly lots of information. I think what I've seen is some companies self-assess and are a little bit optimistic about where they are. So it is worthwhile having an assessment done of your capability, even though it might be a little bit confrontational. But I think for me, having a baseline starting position is a bit of that, let's not kid thyself about where we really are. Organisational change management and communications. So every, I guess, transformation project that I've been involved with, I've actually had to go and work with the HR department or the organisational change management department or the people department. And I've realised along the way that they are absolutely 100% critical to be on board. Resistance to change is something that seems to be a way of resolving change management, a way of resistance to change, is very much a capability that I didn't have. So I definitely built that relationship with the HR department and with the change team to understand how to remove this resistance. And looking at the communication at all levels, one of the key things I've seen in a project that fails for catalogue, particularly because it's customer facing, and ones that don't, much of that has to do with how they were communicated, how they were marketed, and how they were sold internally. And one of the sort of good experiences that I've had is where there's been an entire marketing campaign around it. Now, the catalogue wasn't exactly the most spectacular catalogue I've ever seen, but because of the way it was communicated and marketed, it had a really good outcome, a really good take-up, and people were very comfortable as one of the new channels of IT. And having that option to go to the service desk versus go to an online store was very well received. And certainly as a mobile technology, having it available on mobile phones and available anywhere, anytime, literally. So the question I suppose that people ask is, why change? And when I'm promoting catalogues, you really have to know why you want people to shift towards a catalogue approach. How many people here actually have a working catalogue in their organisation that they consider to be something that they meets the needs of their customers? Yeah? Yes? Right. Yeah. So I guess one of the things I would start out with in a catalogue project is you really have to say, why should we use a catalogue? What's in it for me? The what's in it for me question was very interesting because I'm thinking, okay, we've really got to break this down into the individual scenarios, personas. What is that person going to get? Now, I had a great project experience where it was working for a newspaper, so we had a lot of, let's say, creative people around. And we marketed the catalogue as a movie. So we basically got it as a news feed. So we launched it as an internal newsroom. And we got real people, we went to real desks, we asked people different things that they wanted to buy on the service desk, and we videoed it. And we had a bit of fun with it, I have to say. There was a lot of fun to be had with that project. And we left that behind as a legacy of, this is what started the project, why are we doing this project, what's in it for me? So I would really encourage you as far as the communications and the marketing, putting pictures up, real people, like the people who will be behind the scenes, having photos of people. And, you know, one of the things that I found very interesting was I said to everybody, would like you to take a picture of you, you're a catalogue process manager, and we want to put a poster of you with what the catalogue actually is. And they're like, oh, that's a bit personal, isn't it? And I said, well, people need to attach that somebody owns this thing. And it might be the group of the team. But the reality of it is putting a face to the IT solution really helps people understand about what it is, versus it's just a button to press, a site to go to. They'll be kinder too when it may not go so well on day one if there's issues. You know, they'll have a relationship to it. There's a real person behind this. So the concept of really marketing that, you know, sometimes the technology, I've often had an experience where I thought it was the best thing I've ever seen. And I'll show it to a person who works in finance or marketing or somewhere in the business, and they just look at it and it doesn't do it for me. So it's really important to look at how piloting, prototyping, getting people's feedback, and I do that actually at the beginning. So I have this theory of start with the end in mind. So if somebody can design a page in PowerPoint or a graphics design tool, let's just really jump in there and say, what should it look like? And socialise it. Because that whole front end could be absolutely, what should I say, the back end can be the best built system on the planet. But if the front face is just not getting it, it's just the value's gone, sadly. So there's one of the teams, as I said, we started to put the face of people, the team, and posters up everywhere. People thought I was completely nuts, by the way. It wasn't. It was a stretch. But I really felt that if we could, and as I said, when you've done it enough times, you start to play with things a little bit. You sort of get to be a bit creative and think, well, you know, maybe I could make it an even better successful project than the last one by introducing some more people components to it. So here's some examples of keeping it really slim. Some, you know, regular newsletters, it's coming, building up the interest. And it is really seriously a communications and marketing exercise. Now, service modelling. I'm going to switch it up a bit. Let's go straight into what I mean about service modelling. Now, I brought this up the other day with a customer about digital footprint, and they kind of went, well, what's that? And I said, well, if you break it down into specifics, a digital footprint is the data characteristics that you maintain about that service. It could be the business hours of operation, it could be the service owner, it could be the name of the service, and then all the way into some of the more detailed about who needs to be notified if that service is unavailable. So service modelling in itself is about creating a service model blueprint for services in your organisation that you can roll out at that level. And I guess it's one of those terms. Has anybody really heard the word service modelling before? Yeah? Yeah. So I guess that for me, I was starting to think about, if I'm building a service catalogue and yet I need to have a working CMDB, how do I draw the line of sight? So when you think about, to me, I look at it and say, oop, did I just kill that? Let's go back. I didn't. I saved it. I'll put that down there. So I guess from a catalogue perspective, I call this line of sight. I need to know. I'm one of those detail people. If I see it on a catalogue, and let's say this is, I need a mobile phone, or something maybe a little more complex, employee provisioning, I need to know where does that sit. I actually need to be able to visualise that. So I think that the challenge that some people have is this is three-dimensional, and I'm not sure everybody's nailed how to think three-dimensionally in their head. So that can be complicated. So we tend to start to look at things as a two-dimensional spreadsheet. So again, trying to get people's heads around it. So if I'll draw a little summary and let's see how we go with it. So employee provisioning, you've got IT, HR, facilities, so when we look at IT and we have a series of what I call products, so we might have Outlook, Active Directory, Yep, MS Office. So here we might have some people call it different things, ID. Getting an employee ID might be the summary of I've onboarded a person, they've arrived, they're a real person, they've got an ID, they're in the payroll system, they're going to get paid. So that's step one. Facilities, you know, they might need to, in some order of that, but eventually they give them an access card. Now the service itself, the question always comes down to, well, what is really the service? And different variations. If you create the service that's called employee provisioning, technically speaking, it's really a business process. So I wouldn't be going there and saying that's a service. That's my view. What I would be saying though is that it is a requestable item from these products. So I'll tell you a little tip that I've used, because one of the things that people often ask me is, we're going to build a service catalogue. And I go, okay. Yeah. And I say, well, how do you know what will make up the service catalogue? I think it's fair to say most people could come up with a catalogue that says, you know, it's not working, it's broken, I need something. You know, I need to. I'm moving desks. Now, you know, I've given that high-level design to quite a few customers and said, socialise that with the people, and I mean the real people, like the customers. Then from there, really, what you're talking about is you've got, when you start stepping it up a bit, you've got a business catalogue, and you've got a technology catalogue. And of course, IT people consume both. But in here, you've got all sorts of things like, you know, provisioning a server. You want a design done for a new service or something like that. So this is when you start to break it down into the different functions. And that's great from the top down, but what about from the bottom up? How do you know that every single item in your catalogue is actually all the items that should be in your catalogue? And this is the general conversation that I'd have. The way I do it is top down's great. You've got to do your design top down. That's what customers want to see, the visual. There's a bundling exercise that must go on at some point, and I'll talk a bit about how you bundle. The way that I've always built these is from the bottom up as well. So on the bottom up, you go through and you've got to define all your products across all your services or all your departments. And then the question I ask them is, for Outlook, if I'm talking to a technology team, I say, do you provision it? How do you provision? How do you give permissions? How do you do projects? And how do you procure it? If you ask the 4 Ps for each of the products, they'll think about all the actual requests that they get asked for. So once they've done all the requests, when we fill out, let's say this is services, products, infrastructure, hardware, software. So we know these things can be pretty much discovered. And what you're trying to work out is what's this relationship? And IT people, tower mentality, don't know what's happening in the other tower, don't want to know what's happening in the other tower. They're not great at relationships personally, so I'm not sure why we think they would be technically. Sorry. I come from the world. If I wasn't a WAN engineer, I wouldn't say it. So building these relationships is, I believe, the challenge. But having people have a methodology to follow. Now, when I go into an organisation, all the IT people, I can see the look on their faces. They're thinking, oh God, we're going to fill out these things, and they're trying to solve the problem without going through the process. And the process of developing relationships between products and services is an evolving process. So teaching people what the relationship is between things. I have this saying that it's like pick up sticks with colours. And one of those, what gives it colours is having a methodology for people to be able to follow. So once they've identified all the requestable items by product, you can then go and do a little summary, and I'll show you how you can do the bundling. So this is what I call service modelling. It's actually top down, because one of the things you want to ask people, what are your services? Now, funnily enough, the magic number is 26. If you've modelled enough companies, there are 26 services on average. Now that's a good benchmark, because sometimes when I've been to a customer and they say, oh no, we have 60. I'm like, no you don't. And so we start to look at it. What we've done over the last 5 years is we've collected across all sorts of organisations all the possible services that you could have. So barring your vertical market where you live, so if you're an airline or if you're a transport company or a telco or a bank or a food company, where you have certain things which are particular to your type of industry, there are 26 services. So what we do now with customers is we just have a drop-down list. Pick one. Oh, I've got that, I've got that, I've got that, I've got that. So you can sort of solve that deliberating. And they do. The funny thing is when you go through IT up to this layer, they'll come up with all sorts of really interesting names like collaboration services. And I go, do your customers know what that is? No. So why don't we call it video conferencing? Good idea. So, yeah, it's really just, but I do think that letting IT define their services is an extraordinarily valuable exercise. The reason is, we all know as technical people, if you didn't go through the process, it never happened. So somebody coming and telling you what it is not the answer. It's discovering it yourself that gives you that answer. So we do this discovery at the services, fill in all the services, and then they come back and then we say fill in all the products. Again, a lot of this is, well, what's a product? And that fries people straight off the bat. What's a product? Hardware and software, everybody gets it. There's some little challenges, tricky challenges in here around what I call bundling of products, so generic products. But the outcome of all of this here is that what you want to be able to do at the end of the day, once you've defined your catalogue and it all hangs together, I know I make that sound easy, is that you want to be able to report on it. You want to be able to report here, 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 filter up and down, because people come along and say, I want to know all the software that's going to expire for Microsoft or Oracle. So you've got to have the product as well as the software. Bundling. So just a little bit of ideas there. I've got more details, so we'll keep going. But service modelling really starts to help with defining your hierarchy, your relationships, and alignment to business services. So there is a methodology, and I just wanted to share with you some of that methodology. There is a collection process, validation, consolidation and finalisation, and believe it or not, you can do that in large companies in 4 weeks. So when people labour about this CMDB business, right, I'm just like, I think you're overthinking it. Sure, in tools today, they have all sorts of interesting things like 165 classes, I'm thinking, wow, you know, does that really define all the different types of products? And I just think it's over-engineered significantly. So I'm one of those people that says, let's do the minimum amount, get everybody on board, and let's go from there. It's a bit like, I have this analogy, if your child goes to school with the egg, the boiled egg, and if they come home with it in one piece, you've had a good day. A bit like that with the CMDB. You know, if you can make that CMDB work, and you can hold it together day in and day out, then it'll be really great for you. When you break it, seems to slide straight out the door pretty quickly once people have no confidence that the CMDB actually is valid. Single source of truth, whatever you want to call it. So that's the service modelling process. And then I've got to touch on one of my most favourite topics, which is taxonomy. The other area that I see people really grossly overcomplicate it, and I think for some of you, if you've been in IT for a while, in the good old days they called it CTI, and they had these 3 layers. And one of the things I would do is, when going into an organisation, is I would get them to produce all of their reports if they have a system. And I would get them to do the categorisation, and I would look at, the first rule of thumb is, how many blanks categories do you have? And some companies actually have up to 50% of their transactional data is categorised blank. Now, I'm just amazed that that would be the case. So one of the things about coming up with something about a taxonomy is your ability to classify across all of shared services and have one classification structure. And again, I look at tools today and they have this classification, categories, and it's really complicated. So my rule of thumb is this: if you can put 10 people from a service desk in a room, you can define the problem on a board, and they'll all classify that problem the same way, you've got a good taxonomy. If they classify that 10 different ways, you don't have a good taxonomy, and your reporting will not tell you any information. Your reporting will not be of good value for decision making. So taxonomy is a really important part. Now, of course, taxonomy starts to spread into catalogue because customers want to be able to log their own incidents. So right there, as soon as you have a customer logging an incident, you're forced down the "it doesn't work, how can I" natural language. So my theory has always been that's what I would expect the service desk to use. And having a service taxonomy framework that's really simple, again, number 26, there's 26 things that could go wrong. Shared services, not just IT. And of those, 4 incidents classifications. So it begs this question of when people are logging things in a catalogue, that they only really have 4 things to choose from if it's an incident. Does anybody here have a taxonomy? Yeah? Got a taxonomy? So, again, some people go down that path. I would absolutely encourage you to look up taxonomy. Find something that you can use. So I developed a service taxonomy framework about 5 years ago. And I've been test driving it and continuing to test drive it to make sure it's right. Sometimes I can't believe that I might have got it right, but haven't been able to find too much wrong with it in all sorts of shared services environments. But I do think there's a little bit of, can it be really that simple? People sort of think there's a catch. It really is that simple. It's not a complicated thing. This would drive all of your classification from your catalogue all the way back through the service desk. Process management, one of my favourites. Again, people agonise over this, is our process good or bad? So here's an example. I recently did an evaluation of a customer's process. And these were all the things I found that could be automated. Now, the reason they don't automate, and again, catalogue is your epitome of customer front-facing. It must be automated. It must be selectable from a drop-down menu, minimum text fields. that should drive process improvement, process automation. So again, having all your data, and I don't think it's a surprise, but if you have all of your data for running your service model and you've worked out all your business rules, and business rules I mean if the customer comes in this catalogue and they're in this location, in this company, if it's a multi-company organisation, and they put in this issue, it'll go to that group. First time, every time. That's the epitome of what you want your catalogue to be able to do. So having this automation starts to become necessary. Now often what I see people do is go down the path of developing a catalogue, but they never go back and look at the actual process itself. Incident management, request management, knowledge management, etc. And going back and actually looking at each of these blocks and saying, how could we automate that? How could that be a drop down, selectable? So putting all your business rules thinking before catalogue is really critical. Because the first thing that kills a catalogue is if the customer has to fill out 11 fields. So I just did an analysis 2 weeks ago and I played this scenario to an IT department. I said, okay, you can have your taxonomy, do all your modelling of your services and have everything done before you put it into the tool set. And I can show you that it'll be the difference between 2 fields and 10 fields. Which do you think your customers would prefer? So that, I said it's 2 minutes, if it's a service desk, it's 2 minutes and 2.5 minutes to log it, 21 seconds. So that's to me, you know, some of the benchmarking of what you'd be trying to achieve by looking at a process. So being able to say, you know, all of these fields here, you could cut out process steps, have all the business rules, have it directed to the right place. Around optimising your process is really critical. So we take a lean approach. When I read lean, by the way, for the first time, I really liked it. I thought, you know, I read lots of books about it and started to understand from more of a manufacturing perspective how lean really helped me identify bottlenecks, constraints, theory of constraints. And when I was a project manager, it really made my head spin about how I could start to look at processes differently, project management differently. And I was, you know, got really involved in that whole lean approach. Now bottlenecks in IT are queues, could be queues. Looking at queues, why do certain groups of people have more in their queue than others? Is there a relationship between the number of people that service and fulfill those requests to the number of products and services they support? Starting to look at your organisation, because one of the big killers of catalogues is that you are now starting to commit to a timeline. 5 days, 3 days. And so you want to make sure that your request process and your fulfilment teams are all on board with that fulfilment process. And so finding those bottlenecks is part of that process review. Looking at when things come in, where would those bottlenecks be? Which queues are they going to sit in? Is that because there's not enough people? Is it because it's too manual? And of course, you're starting to now see things like automation come in, bots, all sorts of interesting technology around helping auto fulfillment, which forces you to do, you know, understand your business rules. So with lean, anyone here using lean in their organisation? Yeah, a little bit. Again, I'd encourage you to go check it out. I read the lean book on a flight, like it took a few hours. And it was really useful, but Goldratt is his name, the author, last name, and he's got a series of books that he wrote around the theory of constraints and lean methodology that really inspired me to start thinking differently about processes. So one of the things again about catalogues, you know, sometimes people say, oh, I remember doing a project where I said, how many catalogues do you think you've got? This is a very large organisation. And they said, we think we've got 8. I'm like, okay. So we went round, I looked at all the 8, And one of the things that became obvious was that nobody really wanted to relinquish one of their catalogues. So the catalogue owners of each of those were like, "Oh, no, I'm happy with mine, thanks. And, you know, leave me alone." And so this varied from the end user computing catalogue to a provisioning catalogue with a particular supplier to a desktop, mobile technology, phones. And each one had their own little piece of the puzzle, and they were servicing their customers, and they were very happy with that. However, from a customer's perspective, you had to go to 3 catalogues, at times maybe more, to get what you wanted. So we started to, it was one of those projects where the resistance was so great that I personally felt they had a problem. Seriously, like AA. Until you admit it, you're not going anywhere. And they weren't prepared. They knew they had a problem, but nobody was really prepared to give it up and say, yep, we're going to work together. So in that particular instance, what I did do, which was kind of amusing to me, I wasn't sure it was amusing to everybody, I went through those 8 catalogues and I screenshot every single requestable item. It was 385 pages. And I printed it in colour on thick paper. And I gave it to the general manager on my way out the door and said, if anyone comes to you and says, I'm going to replace your catalogue and fix it, ask them which pages they're going to replace. Because I wasn't convinced that someone was going to come in and replace all of it. But from her, at her level in the organisation, someone would come along and go, yep, we're going to fix the catalogue. So I said to her, just make sure you ask which pages are you fixing, so I know, and I can tag them as I go. Sometimes they create a monster problem. So going and seeing is really important. I leave my desk, I go out into the world, and I see what people are doing. I'm fascinated by what people do versus what I think they're doing. Discuss the problems. And again, asking people what their problems are, because they're not always what you think they are. And sometimes actually I've had the good fortune of a couple of projects where I've launched myself in there thinking I've got problems to solve, and actually it was fixed in about 2 weeks, which is quite awkward when you actually been contracted to be there for like 3 to 6 months, and you realise 2 weeks in the problem's actually fixed. So you say, okay, what do I do now? And you know, for your sins you go and they'll give you a catalogue project. And I used to have a saying about catalogue projects are career-ending projects, because if you get it wrong, there's no going anywhere. So measuring is really, I guess again, it can be difficult if your data or your system that you have, or you don't really have any metrics. Often I've heard people say, it's not in our tool, we can't report on it, there's no baseline. I'm like, you know, Excel's a really good tool and data collection can be done, because at any time in any project, if I don't know the baseline, I'm not interested in continuing, because people are people. If there's no progress, you lose them. People will buy into anything, into a project, into an initiative, continual service improvement, if they know that on the board over there it says our baseline is X and here we are Y and we're progressing. That's when people are motivated. So really important to be able to measure. And that visual representation, I've seen visual representation increase productivity by 25% overnight. The minute it's on the board, because people would say to me, oh, we don't have visual dashboards. Well, I've got a pen and I've got that. So every morning I would come in at 6 a.m. and I would write the service desk stats on the board by team. Oh, you can't do that, you know, it'll be confrontational. And I'm like, yes, it will be. So I would do that every morning. They think I'm nuts. They'd say, you know, why would you do that? I'm like, well, if I can't get a monitor with a dashboard, then I'll just write it on the board. Same result. And then what happened was people would question, but that's not right. I'm like, this is what I want to know. My stats are not being supported by anecdotal information. So what's going on? And then now we've got a conversation happening, right? We've got some blood boiling, we've got some interest, and now we can start to say, well, people say, well, that's just not accurate. Okay, so what should it be? And now we can start to look at what's coming out of the tools, where the data's coming from, who's washing the data, cleaning it up or making it worse. So again, service management planning, whatever that means to you, for me it's really about identifying a service and measuring its performance. And we've all heard the Plan, Do, Check, Act. Now process integration is, I spent a lot, particularly over the last 18 months, I spent a lot of time integrating companies, tool to tool. So it's very interesting when you sit down at the table with two very large organisations who are both got their own processes, and you have to work out how you're going to integrate those processes via the data. And I wouldn't say it was an easy thing to do, because you know, everybody's got their idea of what a good process is and their data versus what the other company thinks. But one of the things that's never sort of ceased to amaze me is when ITIL V3 came out and they published that, I thought, wow, that's fantastic. But hey, what could you do with it? You know, it doesn't mean anything. I used to look at that and I think, oh, it's so pretty, and you know, but where the hell do I fit into that? You know, and I've implemented 21 systems. And also I started in ITIL. When ITIL first came out, I was actually project managing an implementation of consolidating 5 service desks into one. Now they decided on the ITIL framework before I got there, and I'd never seen it before. So the consultants who were doing the framework, I got trained. I was like, yeah, train me. Imagine if I failed. I thought it was going to be a hoot. I'm doing the training with all the people that I'm project managing, and if I didn't pass, I was sort of going to have to sneak out the door. But, you know, one of the things that I learnt about this is great, but even the people that were teaching it didn't necessarily know how to operationalise it. And so one of the things that, again, as people who are in this world of frameworks and IT and catalogues, etc., you've got to find your own methods of operationalising it. What's going to work in your organisation? So I wrote this. This just seemed to sort of cut to the chase for me. What I wanted to know was each of the processes, what was the data? Just tell me the data, because it's IT, zeros and ones after all. If there's no data, it's not happening. So again, you know, I try to simplify it, demystify it, and say, well, what do I want to see between each of these? Now, then I went through and colour-coded it. What have I got? What am I sort of got? And what do I have no idea about? And it started on a page. If I was to then tell someone, I've done an ITIL assessment and I'm building this out, and I want to focus on here, it's red, and how it relates to this, executives actually like this. They can go, oh, okay, I kind of get that. So, you know, we've got incident nailed, we've got event nailed. We're a bit sus on some of these knowledge management. Catalogue's definitely not there. And then all this area here. So if you're looking at a continual service improvement program and or trying to build a business case to get some dollars, this is a really good representation. I encourage you to think about this. I'm a visual person. I need to see it on a page. I do want to talk a little bit about, how many of you are familiar with Service SIAM? SIAM's the latest. Yep. Latest 4-letter word. And so one of the things that we've been focusing on over the last year is that we have actually done a SIAM implementation for one of the large telcos. So what I found fascinating about the whole SIAM component is that this is the new operating model. There are 2 theories on the operating model. One is a government-focused one, and the other one is a corporate, more commercially viable. And the difference is just simply roles. In a commercial world, you would be skinning up the roles. In a more government, you have more of that focus on governance and more ability to have multiple roles or people focusing on specific roles. So this is more of the business one. And you'll start to see things like, you know, toolset integration, and you know, this is again, how is this going to work for services, and how is this going to align to my organisation? How does it fit with service management? and what value does this bring? And again, one of the reasons for its creation was really now we're moving into this multi-supplier. You should be able to define services, have catalogues that go beyond you, and all integrated. And it's a great concept. So really, this is, to me, the service versus process versus operating models. Really interesting. And one of the things, if you're curious about SIAM, at the end of the session, I have built a little application that does service definitions for SIAM, and it does an assessment. And I can give you an opportunity today, if you want to do an assessment. It's a 2-hour exercise, so you're not going to do it. You could have a glass of wine and do it, I get. But what I would suggest is, if you wanted to test out the app and give us some feedback, at the end of the session, just put your details down, we'll grab the login for you, and you can do one service assessment based on this operating model. And that's something that's new. You know, it's evolving. A lot of people haven't got into SIAM yet. But if you're in a multi-supplier, now remember, supplier in the world of SIAM is internal and external service providers. So consider your support groups suppliers. And this will give you an idea of how to start rating the complexity of your services, how they stand up against the SIAM operating model. And once you see it in an application and you log in, I think it's quite fascinating where they're going with the world. There's a little bit of what it does do and what it doesn't do. And again, SIAM really is an agent for the customer. Now, for many of you who've got service management and it's quite mature, you may have already been operating in a SIAM way. So really it would be just to compare some of what SIAM is and isn't. It does not replace service management. And the only other crucial thing that I've found with SIAM is it doesn't fit in the same organisational structure. It sits outside of your traditional delivery structure as a separate governing body. And for reasons it needs to be impartial. So I guess it's a really interesting component to start to look at. And again, this is more of a takeaway for you. I just wanted to give you as much information to have after the session as well about what some of the business models look like and what are some of the benefits. Are any of you recently or gone through a restructure? Yes? Yeah. Everybody's been through a restructure? Yeah? And is it fascinating to see who picks the structure, or how the structure lands and the roles and how it all sort of comes about? Were you all engaging external consultants to do that? Yeah. Anyone do it internally? Yeah. Yeah. It's always. I've been involved with a few, and look, it's not a good place to be when you're looking at where you fit in the structure and getting that sort of comfort that you've got a role or you're competing for your roles again, and it can be quite confronting. And I guess the challenges here are looking at these different components, and Service Catalogue, sort of starts to get in SIAM a world of its own, sitting in here as far as the organisation goes. And I've looked at how service modelling, service taxonomy and definitions fit. So again, I always encourage people to take, I know if you're not a PowerPoint person, but even that, I'm on the board, pressing the flesh about where's my organisation fit in here. Let's just draw it up, because what I found is, even though you may not be a person who understands all the models and the org structures and etc., once you start drawing up your organisation and where you think everything is done in your own mind, not necessarily what the organisational structure from HR looks like, let's assume that, but what actually happens in your organisation. Because the gap between what everybody thinks is on paper going on and what's really going on can be quite different. And you always want to be looking at what's really going on. Because I've seen a lot of organisations try and make changes to an organisational structure, an operating model that it's not even actually what's been implemented. It's what they think is going on. And then they try and make changes to that, which only complicates the problem even further. So I definitely encourage you to have a look at sitting down and looking at your operating models, particularly when it relates to catalogue and CMDB. I'm getting to those topics in a little bit more detail because who owns the catalogues, where they sit in the organisation, has a lot to play in building out an enterprise service catalogue. And you might think that, it's surely people will just follow the bouncing ball, but politics is politics, organisations are organisations, and it doesn't always work the way that you would like. So again, just a little bit more on CIAM. So let's take your operating model. So all of these other components, so your service catalogue, CIAM, configuration data, all sit outside of your operating model, but they have these relationships to each other. And again, encourage you to look at what are these relationships in your organisation. Do you have relationships between the service definitions, what are the published set of services, to what's in your catalogue? What's the relationship? And the naming conventions. How does that relate into your configuration data? And what it tends to do is start to help you with gaps. I'll show you towards the end. I've got a couple of... one of the things that we've done is before you put CMDB data in a tool, you need to know if it's okay. So I built a CMDB builder just because I wanted to know before it went into a tool exactly whether it was working. Did it make sense? Were the right relationships in place? Did every service have a relationship to one or more products? Did every software have a relationship to one or more products? Were there any orphans? And all of that needs to be worked out. I found once it gets inside a CMDB, it gets a world of its own, a life of its own, and it gets away from you. Again, a little bit more complicated, but on the view of the fact that there's a lot of towers. You can have your service management team, a CIAM team, you can have the tool set, and then your functions, your operating model. And your services run across all of it. So you need to, the way that I probably look at everything from very much a data perspective. So if I've got a service name, auto-populate and menus, I need to know within each process where that service name is going to appear and what is it going to do. If the service has a relationship to product, then I can assign via product relationships to support groups. Governance. So I think that one of the things I did do along the way was I had this ingenious idea that I would create an internal service management forum, SMF. And again, people thought I was a little bit nuts, but I thought, well, what's the best way to entertain people for once a month and tell them what we're doing as it relates to something as exciting as processes? And so we created the SMF. Does anybody here internally have like a forum that you have for processes and or the whole of service management? Yeah? So one of the things I think for me made, how do you get something as exciting as a process, how do you get people engaged in that? Because it's, it could be just it's a diagram, it's a document, it's a Visio. How do you get people engaged in that? So the SMF was really about one day a month, everybody came to town and we gave them something to entertain, teach, learn, be interested in. And I found that that gave us a forum. And certainly for catalogue and CMDB, which is a team, both of them are team sports, I really needed to make sure that everybody was engaged and on board, contributing and getting that feedback, because putting out a catalogue or rolling out a CMDB, if you've got significant components of your organisation not on board, you have a problem. So making sure that engagement is measured. Now, I used to do some entertaining things about engagement, and Zorka down the back there, who's with me today, one of the things that we decided was that we needed to measure engagement for Catalogue, CMDB, and all ITSM processes. So the question is, how do you know people are engaged? So we had to think outside the square, because how do you measure engagement? So for a project or transformation, what we would do is that we would send out information, we would create tasks that people had to do as part of that, whether it be read a document, provide us feedback, do some data collection, send that information back, and we would measure the response, how long it took for them to respond. And we did that across 25 stakeholders. Now, I remember the first time we came up with the measurement. I don't cry very often, but I've got to tell you, when I saw the level of engagement, I was going to cry. 35%, I was devastated. I actually took it personally. And I said, how could I possibly be involved in something when my level of engagement is that low? And I was devastated. But what I did notice was that the stakeholders seemed a little bit sort of surprised that I was that upset about it. But once I showed the engagement level, the very next month, it was 55. Goes back to the point of when you have governance, it's great to have governance, but if they're not engaged, you know, there's really no governance. So engaging people, finding ways, new and interesting ways to engage them. And so we gradually got up to for 55, and it started to go beyond that. And I have to admit, it was the first time that I thought I had everyone's engagement. I really did. And I realised I was kidding myself until I measured it. So the governance, you know, people come to governance forums and they sit and they can contribute. But the other way I found to engage governance is continual service improvement. So, you know, they have a charter. You've got to have a charter. It's a document. You can probably Google it. Having a governance charter. What are those people there for, and what do you want from them? What decisions are they expected to make? You've really got to spell out what their charter and their role is. Now, once they, I guess, start that proceedings, one of the things I did with a large organisation, it was a bank, they had 32 general managers, and we set up a governance for continual service improvement. So I went to each of them and I said, what do you want from this forum? Continual service improvement, what is your problem right now? What are you trying to solve? And we came up with about between 30 and 40 things which were bothering them. So what I did do was I created a continual service improvement project schedule. I listed each one of them as the items, and then I met with them and said, well, what are the tasks? What do you think it's going to require to fix this problem? Now, of course, it was a very selfish thing. I wasn't doing it to make everybody happy. What I needed to know was, if I was going to hit the target on improvement across the organisation, was there any consistent deliverables across all of those 32 where I could pinpoint one or two things I was going to achieve that would satisfy the many? So I was looking for the pattern, what was consistent. So from a governance perspective, I think it's really important to be a little entertaining and a little selfish, but you've got to set yourself up for that. You've got to make it really clear about what governance is. Now again, back to the service modelling view, there's another angle on it. Having service owners, again, trying to engage service owners. Now that can be very interesting, because if they're not engaged involved in the process, so they're not signing off on changes, they're not engaged transactionally, it can be challenging to have them engaged at all. What I do see is when I collect data, we recently did a project in Jakarta, and they had 27 services. I think 22 of them were P1s. I think it was Oh no, it must have been less than that. It was like 4 P2s and 1 P3. And I thought, do they not see the problem with this picture? But it's the first time they saw it on a page. So I'll show you the summary report a bit later. So what can be challenging here is everything is critical. So, you know, when it comes down to then defining products, one of the things that we asked them was how many, when you look at this picture, how many products? So I think they had about, what was it, Zog, do you remember? Products, 147 or something like that. 147 products that support these 27 services. Now what's interesting about some of these figures is when you start looking at your own internal service model, what you need to start to compare yourself to is other people in your industry or the best practice, right? So this is the sort of figures that you can expect, proportionate figures. So what I then said was ownership. Who owns the services and products? And there's always a big red flag when they're the same people. And the IT people firmly believed they were the service owner and the product owner. They kind of went, no, we need to rethink this plan. I said, for starters, if you talk about change management, are you telling me that when you make a change on a critical product, that you're the same person that approves this change as the services? And they sort of had a bit of a think about that then. So this is again profiling the ownership and governance, because when they start to think that products and services are the same, it does cause a bit of a challenge with governance, because you're not really introducing that governance structure. Transformation. So transformation used to be pretty cool around 5 years ago. I don't know what you found this, but over the last sort of couple of years it's kind of died off and some new themes are coming through. But I think what it means to me is that transformation is now constant. It's almost become the norm. You're all in a state of transformation. And to me that just means that you're going from A to B over some period of time. Now I like to do things in 90-day sprints. I had this, again, another theory that I used to watch people in projects and I thought, how can I keep them running? Some of these projects last a year, some 18 months. So people tend to lose the plot after a period of time. Focus plot anyway. So I started working on this theory that everything was in about a 90-day cycle. And then Agile came along, so that made me feel better, because they said, oh, well, now it's Agile. I'm going, good, got that. But I did find that people could concentrate and focus and give a lot in a 90-day sprint. And that way I was getting really good value from that focus. Then they need a break for a little week or so. I'm a bit of a hard taskmaster, maybe a week. And then into the next sprint. So one of the things about hitting that target, and I guess one of the where the name of the book came from, Perfume Steamroller, is, yeah, I didn't think it was a great nickname at the time. It was kind of good. Maybe I started to think, well, okay, so I'm getting the end result. I didn't really feel like I had to roll over everybody to get there, but maybe that's how they felt. It's in some cases. But I think the main thing for me was hitting the target 100% of the time, under budget, on time. And I have to say that we did some pretty crazy things to get that happening. I remember one of the projects where I got told that it was the first time, it's not the first time I'd heard it, but it's the first time that somebody came and told me, was that the first time that a project has ever been delivered on time in this organisation, ever. And I thought, it really felt like that too. It really felt like it. There was a lot of resistance, a lot of people didn't want to make it happen. In the end, it was almost like there were more people rushing to stop it than there were rushing to get it across the line. So it can be challenging. So hitting the target, really important for me personally, whether it's just because it's a competitive thing or I just don't like missing the target. I also feel that it's a little bit of credibility. If people are committed to a timeline and people are committed to delivering. How many of you have rolled out a catalogue and it's not been delivered on time? Anyone? Yep. That's a really tricky moment, because you go that whole, if we roll it out and it's not good, you know, everybody's like, oh, it's going to be bad, it's going to be bad. But then you miss the target. Are we going to achieve anything the following week? Is one more week going to make it any better? Really difficult situation, and I've certainly been, catalogue projects are the ones which tend to slip. You know, they get to that day before, the night before, and you can see everybody sweating. And they're just like, no, we can't do it, we can't do it. So, you know, it's really, I guess it's just a cultural thing, or something that you develop inside your organisation or your team. But I think as far as the catalogues are concerned, that's the challenging one. CMDB tends to be back office. You know, people can fake it a little bit more, if that's the right word. And so, yeah, understanding the pain points and painting the picture. I think one of the things I've noticed about people is if they can get a strong sense of what the end game looks like, then they're on board. And I think with a catalogue, that's why I start with the design first. The high level design, I don't have a lot of, I did learn from someone once that had a sign on the back of the door in IT, please leave your ego at the door. So I think it's really important that you've got to put something out there to people, and have that design target to motivate people. So what does the transformation and business case look like? Because when you start talking transformation, you can start talking big bucks. And stakeholders or people where you might be spending money really want to know what are they going to get out of it, what are the benefits. And I guess you might call it partly, you know, in IT, hardcore IT, people are like, yeah, you're spinning a story. If that's what's going to get you what you need to deliver what the customer requires, then call it spinning a story. One of the things I did spend a lot of time on is being able to define what exactly people were going to get and when, and committing to it. So first, at the high level, say what exactly are we going to get? And coming up with statements, it can be very challenging. In the beginning of my career, I just kept thinking, isn't it obvious? You know, you're going to get a CMDB. But now they want to know, what does that really mean to me? So building it out and giving people a series of steps, a maturity roadmap, a sequence of events. And I also think it plays back to that, what I can deliver in 90 days. So I would always look at things and say, well, what can I do? And I'm not saying you would do all of that in 90 days, but what would I achieve in increments along that 90 days? And motivating people to deliver that. I do believe that delivery is a learned capability. I think it's like anything. If you go to the golf range long enough, swing long enough, you get better at it. And I tend to think of IT these days like that, because being able to handle change, roll out something new, improve things, better catalogue, more services in your CMDB, that constant state of changing, growing, improving is something that we need to embed in the way that we do things inside the organisation. I would, for me personally, having been a project manager or doing transformations, I've had to run alongside BAU. And you know, that's a challenge, that can be a challenge. You've got to respect the fact that there's activities that are going on in operations that you are sort of weaving in and out of to get things done. Ideally, if you're in that position, that you would run those projects as a continual improvement program yourself and publish what you're doing. That forces the organisation to recognise it, plus also less of this upheaval. Project needs to come along and make magic. You're already going to be making that magic as you go. So again, I'd encourage you to create these roadmaps. I've done process roadmaps, organisational roadmaps, delivery roadmaps, transformation roadmaps, and publish them. It gives people an idea of what you're up to and what your plans are. But equally, the challenge is delivery. So again, putting things in terms of what are you specifically going to deliver. Sometimes it might be just one thing in a 90-day period, but it's the one thing that you've looked at in the organisation, people have told you has to be solved. And I do understand that before you get to the end of that 90 days and you put it out there, the next things come along. And so you're constantly in that planning, but you've got to stay the course. The thing I think with transformation, and I've been in places where the reason I probably got out of transformation so much is that I used to find the stakeholders were the worst offenders on changing the goalposts. Because they would come along, yes, we've all committed to an end game. If it's a long 18-month or year project, halfway through, the sales have changed course. Oh yeah, no, I've lost interest in that. Now I want you to do X. That can be really challenging because it's difficult for credibility, for staying the course. Busy slide, however, again it comes down to getting the data right. So sometimes I translate those benefits into specifically what data do I need to get, capture, find, and what does it mean in that part of the organisation. So if we go down the left here, services defined and related to service delivery, service owners agreed. One little box, but if you can, and sometimes people say, yeah, but we've got all these services, that's going to take me like a year. Do it for the most important one. Or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, whatever it is. 5's probably the maximum. Start with one, model it, and then repeat it over and over. Bundling of products, again, very much dependent on... I have worked with an organisation that was an interesting exercise. I sometimes used to wonder why I would be in these positions, but I got an opportunity to work in a large bank where it took them 84 days to provision a server. Yes, 84 days. Me too, that's what I said. And somehow that was where they were at. So we sat down and we modelled the provisioning process. And as with anything, once you look under the covers, it's not as complicated as you think. There's just a few little bottlenecks and roadblocks around the place. After 3 months, working with strategy and architecture, we had to model what the patterns were. So what of the 12 types of servers in combination that you could have, what did that look like from a provisioning perspective? What were the rules around engagement, design, etc.? We got it down to 71 minutes. Now imagine that they have hundreds of projects running where they're dependent on servers being provisioned in IT for those projects. So we worked out it was something like $84,000 a day in delayed project time. Just on the project manager themselves having to chase server provisioning over a period over that 84 days. So you can talk about trying to build up some serious benefits. Like people, I think it's important to really go after the quantifiable benefit. There's always a way to quantify it. There's always a way to be creative about it. And I chase those down. Sometimes they don't go anywhere. You know, another example is I mentioned about logging of self-service. If it takes a customer 2 minutes to log a incident or a request and you can get that down to 21 seconds, then you can work out how many of those a day and you could be saving thousands of dollars a day. So each example has how you can create that business case. Quantifiable benefits all over the place. So again, another translation at a different level around ownership. What does it really mean? Accountability. You know, different stakeholders want to see things in different ways. One does not fit all. So, you know, I used to get very frustrated about, I'd come up with these great things, benefits, and I'd go and show one stakeholder and they'd go, oh yeah, that's fantastic. Next to the stakeholder, and they're like, no, doesn't do it for me. So just be prepared that sometimes you need to be presenting hardcore figures to certain people, fluffy benefits to other people, operating model benefits to another. And it is a really relentless part of the work of convincing people that you want to progress, be it catalogue, be it CMDB. It's a hard sell. CMDB is the hardest sell ever. You know, they're looking at this little thing that looks like a relational database and they're like, okay, so? So you've got to actually work out the business benefit of that data in that CMDB. And if it's broken, I think there's also a what if it doesn't work, and what it does do. Very hard sell. So here I get into a little bit more detail. So I do go down to this percentages. Now often people say, how could you put a percentage? Well, if you do enough of them, you eventually start to see the numbers. And they are as high as this, believe it or not. I think most people underestimate when you get your catalogue and CMDB working, the actual financial and productivity change is significant, underestimated. I think what scares people is that sometimes, I used to find this, people would say, okay, so you're going to do a 25% savings, does that mean I'll lose my job? I'm like, no, it's shifting the workload. The idea is to be, these days, you know, so many things changing. We need more people doing projects of improvement than we do working on incidents. If we could have that shift in workload so that you're in that proactive driving change, running alongside the business, you have the time to go and look at what your business actually does. Get out there, coal face. You know, nothing excites me more than to get out inside the business and go and have a look at what the customers are doing and what their customers are doing. That's where IT people need to be. That's my view. And I'm excited more by that, but you've got to have your back end thinking sorted and you've got to have that confidence. But this is the sorts of figures, it's extraordinary. You know, I've run a program, I remember a program where a very large supplier quoted 1.5 million. And I'm thinking, and in my wisdom, I thought I'd send on the sly the program sponsor another quote, just as a joke, for half the price. And he thought, please don't do that. I said, oh, I'm just playing. When we got to the end of the project, instead of delivering it for 1.5 or my 750, we delivered it for 789. Now the supplier didn't like me, I get that. They weren't happy, they probably didn't speak to me again. But that's the kind of figures that you can do it quick, fast, more agile, and you can get better benefits. It is possible to do that. With tools, if you've got some tools and some of the thinking around getting the service modelling right and solving some of those data issues, up front, do it up front. Solve the data, look at the analysis. Do you have your services defined? Do you have your products? Do you have your catalogue design? Do you have your CMDB sorted? Then these are the sorts of benefits that you can go and chase down. But when the back end is broken, the processes aren't working for you, they're inefficient, it is a problem. You really do have to go back in and sort the back office out. So I start to get creative about what we can and can't do. And I bundled service modelling, SIAM and ITSM into the one tool set. It's interesting what people are doing with tool sets these days. That's a whole different conversation. I'm very passionate about tool sets and what they do. But some of the things which are really key, current state steps to fulfil the catalogue items minus future state steps. So getting out there and saying how long does it take, what forms do they fill in, how long does it take to get, and chasing the food chain right from the customer's experience all the way through. Now when you get that fulfilment, that's the customer fulfilment. What about in IT? If they've bought an asset, where's the asset going? Who's maintaining the asset? How does the asset get into the CMDB? Who maintains the life cycle of that asset? Who is accountable right the way through its life cycle until it goes? If you can't model that, you don't know. And I get down to that detail. I take one thing, employee provisioning, and I follow it all the way through, every department. And of course, other things around the catalogue are number of service desk calls diverted to self-help. And it is significant. Actually, I think that one, 20% is probably minimal in comparison. If you get a good catalogue out there, you can divert, I believe, up to 80%. But your taxonomy's got to be as good as Google. I can go in there and say, you know, my mobile phone is not working, and it brings up a series of knowledge articles. And you can teach people the self-help. So again, a little bit more on some examples. And again, you'll have a copy of this, so you can start to sort of maybe look at some of these examples. And I definitely encourage you to go and start looking at some figures. Catalogue items to maintain. This was the one where I saw when people have multiple service catalogues. Look, it does pose a threat to people who are in those roles, so it's a little bit tricky, but the amount of time that people spend on catalogues, maintenance, request items is a significant amount of time. So being able to automate and refine some of those processes, look at the roles around the catalogue maintenance, who maintains the catalogue and how is that governed. You can start to look at reductions. A little bit more on work streams. So one of the things about transformation that I tell people is that it is a multi-stream activity. I've watched them try to do streams serially. So we'll do this and then we'll do that and we'll do this. And I find that people just lose the course. It is better to have all these streams. Now that's difficult to maintain. It is a program of work and it's complicated. These streams are all interlocked. But again, it's something about putting all of the streams down and focusing on those streams, resourcing them appropriately and having people across all different parts of the organisation involved. So traceability, around transformation, we talked about benefits. One of the key things to credibility around transformation is being able to trace those benefits. So if you're saying that you are going to reduce the number of catalogue items or improve the customer's experience, the traceability is how exactly are you going to do that? Now that has to go into a tool set. So one of the things we do is look at functional requirements, break down those requirements, what is your current tool doing and what does the future tool need to do? And actually start to map that out in detail. That traceability is really critical. I'm a bit of a Nazi for the whole, you know, traceability because I just find that if people can understand how it's going to arrive, that they buy into that. And they're not wandering around thinking, oh, you know, I'm not sure how that actually works or why that works that way. It's about taking people on that traceability route. And again, just a bit of an example of what planning looks like. So again, it's another view. Some people need to see it in different ways, and so pulling some of those benefits into a pipeline and some dates. And what it looks like at each stage, each release, in that sort of 90-day theme. And again, it's because if people see progress, like I said to you earlier, progress is one of the biggest things that motivates people in human behaviour. Progress, small steps towards a goal, motivates people. So now we talk about service catalogue. So what I'll share with you is a development phases, I guess, is what I call it. And these are the phases to building out a service catalogue. This is the methodology that I use when I'm building out a catalogue. And I do see it as that there are tools, process, people and partners. So the first step in the development is design. So when you start talking about, like we talked a little bit about the high level design and starting to put some concepts on a page around what it could look like. You know, we talked a bit about the business catalogue, what the personas are, and then looking at the technology components and then the actual service delivery. Self-service, service delivery. I would like to know which services, when they're available, and I want to be able to self-serve that. And the best example I ever saw of that was about 16, 17 years ago, when an internal person who was in the application development area, they were passionate about this self-service. I want my customers to go along and list, they'll have all the services listed and they'll just tick a box, and it'll tell them proactively whether email's working, SAP's down, these changes are occurring, broadcasting, personalised to them based on what they want. So that's the kind of, again, it's expectations. Now people are starting to say, well, why can't I just see a dial of all the services that I'm interested in when I go into the catalogue, service delivery catalogue. And then this is the technology catalogue. And of course, when you start going into HR and facilities, finance, procurement, they also have now a standard set of catalogue items, very much similar to these kind of activities here for IT. So starting to design, again, for each process, looking at how it works between being a request to a business catalogue, to the tool set, through to the CMDB. Line of sight, knowing exactly how each of these items are going to work. And really critical for me is keeping this updated and this cycle of automation. Has anybody got an end-to-end operation just like this? Not yet? Yep. So again, it's maybe an expectation, being able to look at following one all the way through. Pick the one that's the most financially impacting. So if that's laptops, desktops, mobile phones, what's the number one? Actually, it's a good question for you. Just at each table, what's the number one service request in your catalogue, do you think? Come on. Number one requestable item, service password reset. Yep. Have you automated it? Getting there? Yep, password reset. You guys in the middle? You guys got a, what's yours? What's yours?
Mine's going to be password reset.
Yep.
Well, we've got an account check task that we do for external providers.
Right. Yep. Anyone else? What about your table? Any volunteers? You want user accounts? Yeah. How about you guys? What's the? Yeah. Yeah. And down the back? Yep. Cool. So you're probably thinking, 80% of the time in all organisations, probably going to be about the same. So I guess being able to walk through that and define it is one of the first things we tend to do with every organisation. The user accounts, being able to define exactly where that flow goes and how long it takes, and mapping that out also from a service level perspective. So how long does it take? What do they have to go through? And actually following that trail and sitting down with the person who does each of those provisioning activities and walking that form through. Highly fascinating, and what you'll find is there are huge opportunities to improve. So this one is a little bit different for technology. Again, there are many internal technology requests, provisioning projects, etc. that have a different workflow. So making sure you understand what that workflow is. I've seen some enormous benefits in the technology side where, well, different companies do it differently. They have a design form. The design form is like this long. You know, every possible variation that you could possibly have of all the questions a technical person could ask to get the server that they needed, versus just model it, give them 12 options, pick one. So again, there's possibilities that you might be in a position to make some really rapid improvements. I did find going to some of the IT guys, like the guys who did it, I got one of two responses. There's always one person who thinks that they can give you all the answers and they probably have thought it through and you should just jump on some of those. And then there are the guys just like, yeah, it is the way it is, we don't want to change anything, it is, you know, let's not upset the apple cart. So you've got to find that I've got to get in there and I've got to make some changes. Sometimes you have to do it around them, over them, under them. They're not everybody's on board for change. So bundling ownership and maintenance. So bundling is a really important component. Being able to bundle, and I have it here. So going through all your requests, so we talked a bit about going a bottom up, let's get all the requestable items. And some companies are still with one item per form, so they can manage one thing per form. Not the best customer's experience, but if you're going to start bundling, the best way to do that is if you go and grab all your forms, list all the form fields that are common across all your forms, even if if you're a big organisation, pick the top 10. So look through all your requests for the last 12 months. That's how I do it. If I do an analysis, I went into a bank. What's funny is I went into the bank, I looked at their 353,000, I didn't personally look at every single one, but there were 353,000 requests in 2014. And what I was looking for was what was the pattern of what people were requesting, to prove a point to myself. But when I started to look at the forms, I picked the top 10. Then you look at what are the common elements, because your biggest bang for your buck is automating the one at the top of the list. So you can't say who it's for, so we know that, you can't automate that. Although that'd be cool if they logged in and auto-populated, there's a win. Email, address, phone, requester, and there's some company information. So some you can, some you can't. So this is looking at how many fields are consistent across all service requests, that if you automated them, you would be solving the problem for every request. Focus on the things that are critical. I was saying earlier out there, many companies focus on maintaining data that's useless, never used. So only maintain the data that's critical. That's the best use of time. So again, that's a method for being able to identify which data elements in your forms, in your catalogue, you should automate. Now, some of them are more, we all start out with, oh yeah, but we can't do the company because it's too complicated. Or we can't do this, we can't pick up locations because that's really complicated. Well, someone figures it out. So let's try and figure out what that business rule looks like and let's automate it. Now, request workflow, again, fascinating to do the exercise of your top requests, because it's again a visual, and in visually you can identify improvements. But if you think you know what the process is and you haven't inspected it, you really don't know what the process is. And listening to other people tell you what the process is also not relevant. You've got to go and see what it is and map it out. Even if you don't have Visio, I draw things, I stick them on the wall. And then I walk people through it over and over, making sure it's correct. On the deployment, you know, everybody talks, I know the sort of the humorous part is big bang or slow, I was going to say slow and painful. Rip off the Band-Aid, slow and painful. I still go back to that one. Look, it's really a cultural, I prototype everything. The reason I would prototype and pilot is that sometimes you think, or even people tell you, oh, if you get it wrong, you know, that'll be the end. But if you prototype it with the most important, influential people in your organisation, and you let them know that you're doing that, because you want their help to actually get it across the line. You'll find that once people have turned the corner and they're using a catalogue, people will demand it. And that's the best way. They want to use it. Obviously, the measure of success is that all of a sudden there's no phone calls to the service desk and everybody is on the catalogue. CMDB. So let's get down to some data detail. People always, when I think about CMDB, which attributes, how many, who maintains them, etc. So what I did was I came up with a series of attributes that I call primary and secondary. What were the minimum attributes you have to maintain for your CMDB to be successful? And who owns them, and how often, and how are they going to update them? Via process or manually? Is it going to be a CMDB administrator versus is it going to be the support group that supports the environment? So it's federated or centralised. But what I did was I came up with this data hierarchy of relationships. And I kept it to a minimum to begin with, because to me, your building capability is about finding out where you're at right now. What do you have all of this information about a service? Do you know its vital business functions? Where in the business is it used? Because when people do a criticality, that criticality is shaded by time, the process. Is it payroll? Is it a portal to your customers, externally facing customers? Is it a sales tool? What actually drives the revenue? So I look at it and go, brand damage, revenue. As they seem to be there's several others, but if you focused on those two, what are those, and go out and find out. If this doesn't work for 2 hours, what's the revenue I'm going to blow out the door because the system's not available? So again, asking IT, I've asked a lot of IT people what's critical, and what they, like you get the 22 things priority one. If it's broken, it's going to affect everything. But there are degrees of doing that. On the product side, a little bit more detail. This is where I mentioned about getting into your product request by product is a good way to collect the information from the bottom up. Hardware, software. So when you look at all of that, it's about 60-something attributes. So the first thing I do with companies is send me what you have of these. And then and I'll show you, if we don't get time while I'm here, out the back when we get outside, I've got a one-page report that tells a customer within a month what the health of their CMDB is. And the only benefit to that is that they just need to know what data they need to go and fix. Because it's a bit like rabbit in the headlights. Everybody goes, oh, the data, Well, which data? Is it you don't know your license information, but you know everything else? So what we look at is completeness. We look at certain primary fields to give them a health of their CMDB. It just takes you're always concerned about things that you don't know the whole story of. This gives you the actual story, therefore you have a plan to fix it. Now, varying degrees of the CMDB is the centre of the universe. Well, it is as far as the tool's concerned, and the service desk is the centre of the universe as far as I'm concerned for customers. Service desk, catalogue, etc. So again, I start to delve into the detail because it demystifies what the CMDB is. A particular attribute in a form for incident, request, knowledge, to make it autofill. There is a direct relationship to data here and ability to fill this out in a catalogue, and so you need to have drawn that out. So for example, you can select a service. Unfortunately, some of our customers have learned our product names, but you can do a service, related products. Products will definitely relate to the primary support group. In an incident, logged by a catalogue or by the service desk, getting it to the first team the first time, right team the first time. Asset management, I picked asset management because one of the biggest bang for the bucks in CMDB to catalogue, line of sight, is handling of assets. It's one of the things that gets lost because they're not connected. So you can procure a whole bunch of assets, you don't know who owns them, you don't know where they are. That's a huge risk in the organisation. So I use this because, you know, this is the kind of information that people are probably most familiar with when it comes to CMDB, kind of assets, has a relationship to a financial situation, but also catalogue driven. Another sort of, for the hierarchical relationship people, being able to define the SACM, Service Asset and Configuration Management. How do you control things and maintain and govern them once they're in the CMDB? So one of the things that I often have watched people do is determine whether their CMDB will be maintained federated or centralised. Now I'm a fan of federated. The reason I say that, it depends on the person who's running your centralised department. If the person who runs your centralised department knows all about infrastructure, they've been in IT for 30, 40 years, they could probably be a great CMDB administrator. But they would then need to know about when things are changing, adding new services, products, etc. So I would look at more of a centralised approach, but the reality is, federated approach. The reality is you can have both. But it's really critical to define the roles, what people do. And I think once you've defined those roles, then you really look at your culture. Is your culture of going to help you and support these roles, or you really just, you know, got to start thinking outside the square about who maintains CMDB? Is it at the end of a change process? How do new CIs get introduced? So we're just about to wrap up, and I've got some time for question and answers, but I will be outside as well. Just a bit of a sort of summary. One of the things about service management planning is being able to, as I said, build your CMDB outside of your tool, give you a health of where you're at. The other one here is about defining your services, and you'll be able to log in and have a look at that if you'd like to at the back. So has anybody got any questions that specifically they want to ask me? No? We're all done?